All right. Well, it is 11:02, and good morning to everyone. If you're on the East Coast, good afternoon. Thanks for joining. We've got the call today with George Seay. So if you're on the call, you've RSVP'd, and we're excited to have you join us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to George to kick things off.
All right. Well, good morning, and thank you for giving me the gift of your time this morning, everyone who's on this call, because I don't take time lightly. It's the commodity we all have the least of, and it's kind of, not to be negative, but it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, where the Wicked Witch of the West turns the sand dial over, and Dorothy's time is running out. So hopefully you won't feel like your time is running out during this call. Hopefully I'll be concise, succinct, and to the point, and then we can open it up for Q&A. Please keep in mind, I'm doing these calls just because I really like to multitask and do a whole lot of different things. It makes life more interesting for me, and I want these calls to be useful and interesting to you. So any critiques, anything you'd like to hear from differently, anything maybe more provocative, more unusual, more interesting you'd like to hear, lob those ideas out there to me by email or text or phone. I'd love to hear from you on that, and I want this to be value additive for everyone who's on the call. So this morning, our topicality, which we may all be sick of at this point, is the election of 2020 and its effect on the economy. And I would argue that the latter part of that is more important than the former part of that preserving this economy after a pandemic and all this disruption and all that, and helping it grow again and helping the millions, if not tens of millions of Americans who've been harmed by what's happened to our country. That's where our focus and our attention really needs to be long term, and getting people back to work and providing for families and allowing people not to worry that their utilities are going to get cut off in the winter because they're out of money. It's a big deal. So I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes like I usually do. I may run over a little bit because there's a lot of content to cover. And then we'll open it up for Q&A the last 20 to 30 minutes of the call. And when we run out of people who want to ask a question, then we'll sign off, and that's it. So we should be done 45 minutes, 40 minutes, maybe 50, something like that. If we do give you a live question, if you could be succinct and ask it as ask your full question, but try to ask it in as short a time as possible so we have more time for others to make comments. So starting up, let's face it, from a 35,000-foot view instead of a treetop view, 2020 will be a year we will never forget. We should step back and have some context and realize we're living through historically significant times. We haven't had a pandemic of this magnitude for 100 years, which is almost 4 generations, really is 4 generations. And we haven't had rioting and social protests of this magnitude for over 50 years. So this is a really singularly awful year. And we'll remember this the rest of our lives. And I think we have to maintain good humor about that, because you always want to stay upbeat in life even when things are difficult. And I would submit beyond that with all the attention on the presidential election this year, because of how strongly people feel about Trump one way or another, and I would say right-thinking people being concerned about the capabilities of Joe Biden if he were to win, since he's 78 years old when he would have won, and he's clearly pretty frail. It's even more important, quite frankly, to assess where we go as a country in the next generation of time. With our national debt so high, with all these social protests and unrest, with the clash of civilizations we're seeing, Judeo-Christian traditionalists versus secular humanists, traditional American values versus woke progressive values, First Amendment rights versus attempts to scale back on such to create safe places, stamp down on hate speech, and stifle religious expression and practice that goes against modern culture and behavior. We're living through a very unique period where there's a lot of strife and divisiveness. And what the country looks like after the next presidential cycle from 2025 on, I would argue is even more important. I would further argue that which of the two septuagenarians who wins the presidential election this year, both of whom are past their prime as leaders and managers, is not the biggest issue we face. It's more this clash of civilizations and these divisions in American life and culture, and what 2025 on looks like. Will it be Bernie Sanders' AOC woke progressive socialism in the country, or will it be a revitalized conservatism? certainly if Joe Biden wins, your taxes are going to go up, your regulations are going to go up, and the economy will be likely to grow slower. But I don't buy all the arguments that the federal government from 2021 to 2025, if he wins, are going to all of a sudden turn into socialist radicalism across the board. Sure, there'll be some of that, but I really do think Biden and some of his longstanding associates will add some degree of moderation to the federal government. So the change over the next 4 years might not be as dramatic as some are expecting. But but if Trump wins again, let's talk about if he were to win again. You know, the economy is going to probably grow faster, and the economy would be better, and the country would be more pro-business, more pro-Main Street, and there'd be more prosperity. But we'd probably see an additional healthy dose of volatility and more fighting and rioting and more fighting in the government, and perhaps expanding out into the streets still. So I would argue what comes even after this cycle will determine what our country looks like for our children's and grandchildren's generations. So before we get to the economy, let's look at the political landscape. Let's look at Texas first. The Republicans have a majority in the Texas House of 9 seats, down from 52 seats in 2010. So they've lost a lot of seats in the last decade, and I don't think they're going to lose the House. There's a lot of hopefuls on the left that hope that the Democrats take the Texas House this cycle. I think there's several seats that probably shouldn't have flipped in 2018, and that with John Cornyn on the ballot and even Trump, that we'll flip a couple of seats probably the other direction, so the Republicans will maintain the Texas House, which most importantly, many of you know that every 10 years the lines are redrawn, redistricting occurs, and districts are remapped. And it's really important, if you're a conservative, that Republicans control the Texas House and Senate for redistricting. I would add one thing, though, that last time around, a lot of self-interested maps, both for Congress and the Texas Senate and Texas House, were drawn, and they evoked a lot of court challenges because some of the seats were kind of 80-20 seats and all that. And if Republicans are smart and want to survive court challenges, and also I would say try to maximize the effort at retaining both bodies and being held to the fire of putting up the highest quality candidates as possible, because that's eventually what wins elections, that they ought to draw as many 60-40 and 55-45 districts as they can. Because in districts like that, you're still going to win if you're smart and capable enough to put really outstanding Texans running for office. And if you put up bad candidates, they're going to lose. And that's how it should be. I don't really have much to say about the Texas Senate. Republicans may lose a seat or two. They may get one back. It's going to be pretty close to a scratch, I think. In Congress, Republicans lost 3 seats in 2018 that they desperately want to get back this time around. And the Democrats are playing on lots of fronts and are hopeful that they're going to pick up even more. I don't really know how that's going to turn out, to be honest. I think it really depends on how well Trump runs. If he barely squeaks by in Texas, we probably will have a hard time regaining a lot of these seats. And if he wins by 4, 6, 7% or more, and John Cornyn wins by double digits, we'll probably pick up a couple of those seats. And the races that people are really focusing on in our area are Genevieve Collins, my friend Dick Collins' daughter, who I want to give a shout-out to both of them this morning, running for Jim Collins' old seat, her great-uncle, I believe, and currently held by Colin Allred. And that's a really tight race. So if you're interested in congressional races, whether it's Genevieve or Beth Van Dyne, you can really make a difference, because both of those are really close, and they're going to come down to the wire. And the final one would be Tony Gonzalez down on the border, and then Wesley Hunt. He's running for a seat we lost in Houston. And those are both going to be tight races. And Gonzalez is a really nice guy, and both those people are veterans, really outstanding Americans in great races. So let me talk about the National Senate races real briefly. John Cornyn's going to win going away. And a lot of the seats people have been focused on for a long time are probably not going to be close. Martha McSally in Arizona is way behind, and she's going to lose. She's a super nice person and very accomplished, but she's just not a very good political candidate. She just doesn't present all that well. And I'm just being as blunt as I possibly can. If I offend anybody who's dear friends with these people, I'm just trying to give straight talk here. Cory Gardner, I think, is the most capable person running this year in terms of his capacity as a politician. He's just a great guy, and he presents super well. And the reality is Colorado's a blue state, and he's probably going to lose. I hope not, but probably he's going to lose. Montana, Steve Daines, that's a seat Republicans kind of have to hold, and because Trump runs so strong in Montana, and Steve Daines is a really nice guy, that seat will probably be held. It shows what a great guy Steve is that he's hanging in there because he's running against a very popular ex-governor. Susan Collins in Maine, Susan's behind in all the polls. So how Trump performs in Maine is probably going to affect her a lot. That would be a shame if she lost. A lot of far right-wing Republicans label her a rhino and run her down all the time. And that's just completely unfair. In the state of Maine, Susan Collins is as good as you're going to ever get. If she votes conservative 70% of the time, that's a lot better than a Democrat that's going to vote 0% of the time conservative. And she's a really principled, super smart person. And her defense of why she voted for Judge Kavanaugh was just spectacular and a great exercise in courage and American patriotism and doing the right thing. So I would encourage people to watch that on YouTube if you haven't. North Carolina, Tom Tillis may or may not win. He's just not that strong a candidate, I would say. Georgia, the Republicans will probably hold serve, but the Kelly Loeffler, the Senate incumbent who's running in a contested primary, she may be vulnerable because she did these silly stock sales right before the pandemic, which was a huge error. And I think she's been basically cleared of that, but it just was just really foolish. We ought to change the rules where senators have to hold mutual funds or index funds, and they don't really even know what they have, and they leave it to somebody else to take care of. Them owning individual stock just brings all sorts of conflicts of interest into play. Republicans have a shot in Minnesota. They have a shot in Michigan. Unlikely they're going to get both of them, but they're in play. And then finally, Alabama, the Republicans will pick up a seat there. So whether the Democrats or the Republicans take the Senate, it's going to be super tight. Presidential, I'll keep this brief because people talk about this too much already. It's I don't know about y'all, but probably 6 to 9 months before an election, I'm already ready for it to be over with. So watch for this, because this is how it played out in 2016. There's about 6 to 8 states that are really in play, and look for the margin of error, which is typically 1 to 4%, depending on the polls. If Trump is within the margin of error in all these states, he wins. If he's in the margin of error in 3/4 of them, it's probably going to be a squeaker one way or another. If he's outside the margin of error in the majority or more of these states, Biden's going to win, and it might be a blowout. That's what you really ought to watch for. Last time around, when the hopelessly biased media was saying Hillary had a 95% chance of winning, I had the wonderful opportunity to do a speaking tour of major British universities, Oxford, Cambridge, University of Edinburgh, King's College London, and I handed out a book called Hillbilly Elegy about a man who came out of poverty, J.D. Vance, in Appalachia, and how middle class to lower middle class to poor Anglo voters felt left behind by the Democratic Party there and were ripe to be flipped, and that's exactly what happened. But also that I told everybody that all the swing states that year were within the margin of error. And that the election was more a 50-50 election, not a 95-5, and that the media was way overstating that. So keep an eye on that, and that'll tell the tale. And I would say that the very small number of Americans that are still open-minded, 5 to 15%, I think they're going to tip one way or another pretty aggressively in the last 20 or 30 days, and that will decide the election. And I'd give 40% chance to Trump winning in a squeaker. I'd give 30% chance to Biden winning in a squeaker, and I'd give a 30% chance to Biden beating him worse. So that's how I'd play it out. I'd bet on a Trump victory, but I'd bet $1, and I wouldn't bet a lot of money. Okay, let's go into the economy, which to me, frankly, is much more interesting these days, and the effect of these politics on the economy. I like to look at issues on a real cold-blooded, objective, rational way. I don't really get emotional about these politics, so I like to try to just get to rational viewpoints on how things are going to break out. So let's say we get a Biden victory, you're going to have slower growth, higher taxes, more regulations, more pressure on Main Street and small business, and more power to big business and the federal government. But will the stock market collapse if you're an investor? I don't think so. You might see more volatility and much lower returns than the previous 5 to 10 years. But having said that, watch this. The key will be, does inflation come back due to all this crazy money printing we're doing? We haven't seen real inflation in 40 years. If you couple real inflation with slow growth, do we move into a period of stagflation a la the 1970s? A lot of people don't even remember the 1970s at this point, but it was just absolutely awful. Real returns on stocks in the 70s was around -7 a year because inflation was so high. That would be absolutely dreadful, and that's the thing you want to watch out for. If inflation really starts to explode, you really ought to move some capital into gold and other commodities, real estate, and move some money out of the U.S. dollar-denominated investments and into overseas markets, and sell your bonds or reduce your bonds, because bonds do terrible during periods of rising interest rates and higher inflation. Just keep an eye on that. You know, most people would bet against inflation making a comeback, but what we're seeing right now is unprecedented, so you really can't rule that out. If you get a Trump victory, you're going to get a more robust economic recovery just by function of numbers and math. I mean, taxes are going to be lower, and there's going to be less red tape, and there's going to be a focus on Main Street manufacturing and fair trade as well as free trade, which, quite frankly, I was wrong about. I was such a big free trader, and I actually like what he's done in terms of confronting other countries on trade. You're going to have more pro-policies towards fossil fuels, less red tape, faster growth, better for the economy for certain, but perhaps not dramatically different from Biden with all this debt we're carrying around. So I'm not sure there's going to be an extreme difference there unless we get into a period of stagflation. I really think that this is quantitatively provable, that people overestimate how much each political party can change the directionality of the country. If you look at the battleship USA, maybe the political party can move the country 3 degrees left or right, but it's not 30 degrees, at least not until now. Maybe 2025 is different, but I would argue it's not going to be different until then, that things will change somewhat depending on who wins, but not dramatically, except you get ready for higher taxes if Biden wins. So I want to talk about Texas briefly in conclusion, then we'll open it up for questions. Thank God, and we all can agree with this, even the folks out of state, I would assume, we live in Texas. We're likely winners no matter how 2020 works out, or 2024, or any elections after that. People are pouring out of high-state, high-regulation states and fleeing for here in Florida and other southern states. However, if we become the largest population state in the country by 2050, passing California, how are we going to build enough roads, schools, educate enough Texans, especially Hispanic young Texans, that they qualify for the increasingly high-tech and service jobs that pay the best? How are we going to provide public safety to all our citizens, enough power, enough clean water, and everything else that makes Texas great? It is a super big, heavy lift. And if you want to use super big as a term of art, go right ahead whenever you want to. It's a really sophisticated phrase I'm using there. And as much as we all like to keep government in Texas as little as possible, and most Texans do, frankly, if we go from 30 million people to 50 to 60 million people as is projected, government is going to have to play a constructive role in core functions expected from the public sector: roads, education, energy, water, public safety, and the like. And the answer will not, the right answer to these questions does not arise to shrinking the size of government as proposed by some far-right groups, even in the face of 100% potential population growth, or taxing and spending like a drunken sailor on leave, like woke progressive think tanks call for. That's what's driving California, New York, Connecticut, Illinois, and other leftist states right into financial ruin. The answer, on the contrary to both those viewpoints, is in prudent, efficient, highly functional growth in government in proportion of population increases in inflation to meet very real demands on government services. And Texans should demand excellence and efficiency from their state government, period. This is not Washington. This is Texas, even if Austin is as navy blue as you're ever going to see, without raising taxes or overburdening our citizens so they can live free and keep as much of their income as possible and focus on their families and communities. That will be quite a feat to pull that off in the coming years. The challenges are real and they're big. But I would argue that what Texans can foresee and aspire to, Texans will do. It's in our blood. It's in our past. It's in our character. One of the great lessons in life and faith and culture is never forgetting who you are. Texans are, for the most part at least, fierce, ambitious, bold, daring, conservative, traditional, and faith, family, patriotism oriented. This fundamental character and can-do spirit will shepherd us safely into a wonderful future if we don't forget who we are and what we stand for. The stakes are going to be super high in the coming decades. If we're going to actually take the next step up as a state, the stakes are as high as they've ever been, because the alternative is what happened to California when they were about our size, where their educational system in primary and elementary schools, elementary and primary and secondary schools, went from top 10 to bottom 10, and where their infrastructure is crumbling, and where the distinction between the wealthy and the poor is as vast as any state in the country, despite all the progressive rhetoric out there. All right, the stakes are high, and I'm certain the quality of the questions is about to be high. So let's open it up for Q&A.
Great. Yeah, we're going to transition now to Q&A mode. Great. So if you have a question for George, you can follow the instructions and press *6 and ask a question. You'll be added to the queue, and we'll call on you. But we did have a few questions, George, that were submitted in advance, so we're going to start with those. And I'm really excited about the first one, which came from John Frimes, and it is, what is your forecast for auto industry / Tesla electric vehicles and the effect on the petroleum industry?
Oh, what a great question. I love this question. So Tesla, my recollection is the market value is now equal to GM, Ford, Daimler-Benz, Chrysler, and Toyota, if I left that out, combined. I may be wrong about that, but it's way larger than Toyota, which is the second business, and larger than BMW and all those combined. And Tesla's basically a break-even company right now. So if you're a gambler, Tesla's great, because it's gone up 10x in the last year. If you're a pragmatist and you actually like keeping a lot of your money, if you're a long-term investor, it's probably a bad idea. Maybe not. But ironically, I saw an article the other day that compared Tesla to the fracking industry, because the fracking industry and Tesla have both seen just gigantic growth over a period of 5 years or so. But the reality is the volume unit growth of Tesla really isn't that strong. And to grow into a $400 billion valuation, which I believe is near where it's peaked at from a valuation standpoint, Tesla really needs to make $20-30 billion a year. And are they the only car company that's going to be making electric cars around the world? I don't think so. And you just saw GM take a $2 billion stake in Nikola, which another investment firm has said is a gigantic fraud. So it's a very extreme time from that standpoint. I think that back to progressive woke left politics. So fossil fuel companies, and I've had a couple of friends debate me this pretty fiercely, but I think you have to face reality as reality is. And reality is oil and gas companies are the new tobacco companies. Is that fair? No. Do we have to have petroleum and natural gas to run our world and not go back in the Stone Age like AOC and the Green New Deal people would like to do? Absolutely. We really need it. But probably oil and natural gas are going to go slightly different paths over the next 10 to 20 years. There is a full-on, full-court press in the developed world to extricate us from using petroleum for all its purposes, especially transportation. And I think it's going to be really hard for oil to be anywhere near where it was in the 70s when it was dominant across all the landscapes in the world. It's going to be a surviving, functioning industry, but I don't think that the rip-roaring amount of supply we saw 4, 6, 8 years ago is going to come back to that degree. And to get a price on oil that makes these companies viable and not fall into bankruptcy, I think you're going to need to see $60 a barrel on West Texas Intermediate crude to be there. And I think we're several years of transition away from getting there. You might have a golden era of 2 to 4 years where demand catches back up, and because of the pullback in fracking and the pullback on major oil and gas projects offshore and like that we actually can't bring enough supply to bear, and oil temporarily goes maybe to 80, maybe to 100, maybe to $120 a barrel. But I think that'll be temporary. So you have to be really careful in terms of how you invest in oil and gas companies and not buy overly leveraged companies. And I've chosen to really focus the most on pipeline businesses because they're basically toll roads. You have to transport this stuff. and with all the opposition to building new pipelines, the current group of pipelines gets more and more and more valuable because you got to move it around somehow, and it's a lot safer to move it around on a pipeline, no matter what you read in the mainstream media, than to ship it around on trucks or trains. That's much more dangerous. Natural gas has a brighter future unless the what I would call the religious cult-like aspects of climate change set in, because there's quite a few on the left that are now opposing natural gas even as a fuel because it leaks methane at times and because it's so much more cleaner than coal, but it obviously not as clean as nuclear, which is also out of favor, and wind and solar, and everybody wants to go to wind and solar. And the reality is, if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, you're not going to get power from those sources. And the sun doesn't shine about 12 hours a day, and the wind consistently doesn't blow. So I think gas is imperative. And I think the natural gas industry in the U.S. and around the world, if they can ever stop drowning the world in supply and get the supply more balanced with demand, if you can get $3 a foot gas, which is kind of to me the right price for consumers and producers, natural gas got a really bright future. And again, I think the pipeline companies are most attractive. Upstream companies tend to be weaker and their balance sheets more speculative, so that's a tough area to be. So hopefully that answers the question well enough. I think fossil fuels have a good 30, 40-year life ahead of them, but it's going to be diminished.
Thanks, George. We're actually going to go to our queue, and this is a very direct question from David Nelson. What is your recommended timing on charitable gifts?
Well, that's interesting, and it's a good question. Let me back up before charitable gifts and talk about taxes. So the day after the election, if the Democrats have carried the presidency and the Senate as well as the House, anyone who's got capacity from a gift tax or a state tax exemption amount or monies that you can get down under current law, you ought to consider doing that to the extent possible, because it's almost certain the Democrats will take tax policy back to much higher rates and much lower exemptions from a state tax and gift tax. And I think it's really imperative to take action this year on that. On charitable contributions, so you can assume that if they control the legislature and the executive branch, that they'll raise income taxes next year. They'll raise every tax they can't lock down. So your charitable gifts next year, unless they limit the amount of deduction you can take, will actually be more effective at those higher tax rates than at the tax rates we have this year. So I might consider being even more generous next year if you can afford to be so, because you get a better tax deduction from that. So I hope that answers that question. I'm always a fan of putting money in the nonprofit private sector rather than sending it to Uncle Sam. As much as I love Uncle Sam, I think that even nonprofits allocate capital better than the government, although for-profits allocate capital the best.
Thanks, George. We're going to go to a caller in the queue. I believe it's Mr. Hicks that has a question, so we're going to unmute his line. And Mr. Hicks, are you ready to ask your question?
Yes. So, George, your prediction about Texas in the future, I was intrigued by. In all those other states, California, New York, Illinois, Jersey, Connecticut, the biggest pressure that's created their bankruptcies is the unfunded public pension liabilities. It creates a spiral. There's nobody to negotiate because they're feeding on each other. They back Democrats, and Democrats raise their pensions. How do we in Texas ever make sure we don't allow that to happen as our population grows? Can you ever get the Democrats in Texas to realize it would bankrupt us?
Tom, what a great question. And I got to say, Tom, you've had 10x the career I've had in your life. So for you to be asking me a question, I'm very humbled by that. And I'm going to give you a good answer to that question, too. I think it sums up, and you're hitting on something most people don't understand at all well. There's a foundation in Houston that a billionaire is funding and trying to spur pension reform, but it's a heavy lift and it's tough. I think luckily our pension funds so far, especially statewide, have been run a lot better than other states, although they're still underwater. I think where the real bifurcation and the real risk is the pension funds in our Democratic blue cities that are getting more and more blue every year. and the tendency is to increase the benefits to levels that are unsustainable, and everyone projecting 8 to 9% annual returns as far as the horizon is. And you and I both know that it's going to be hard to make half that return if you're in a balanced portfolio the next 10 years. So that your unfunded liabilities are going to get worse and worse and worse. I would say the answer is, in terms of statewide, is to keep Texas statewide government conservative and Republican, so that we run the state government like we run a business. It's kind of what I was saying about the state basic services we've got to provide. We got to do that. Like, for instance, there's been so many cutbacks at the DMV that if you take your kid or grandkid to get a driver's license these days, you got to sit out there for 8 hours. It's so inefficient, and Texans won't stand for that. We should be as efficient in the public sector as we are in the private sector. So you can't starve the state government of resources. You've got to give it what it needs to do its job, but without raising taxes, and that's the trick. You got to run it like an efficient business that does its job and doesn't require additional raised taxes or capital beyond what's just required to do the job. So if we control state government, it's likely that state pensions are going to remain prudent and moderate and not out of control. And if you have a conservative state government, and I hate to admit this, but Dallas, we had a major scandal in the firefighter and police pension fund because it was so mismanaged, and the benefits were just outrageous. They were so high. But whether Dallas or Houston or San Antonio or Austin or El Paso come hat in hand to the legislature and ask for a bailout, if you got conservative leadership, they're going to tell them to go pound sand and work out their problems on their own. And so that's, to me, how you avoid a statewide pension crisis. But I think local pension crises, which we've already seen with the Dallas police and firefighters, I think they're inevitable. I hate to be negative, but I think that's coming because, whether it's the teachers' unions or police unions or firefighters' unions, they're going to always press for over-the-top benefits, and it's going to create strain on the system. I hope I answered your question enough.
Well, California used to have Republican leadership. They don't, they had a tilt. Once a tilt occurred, it's game over.
That's exactly right, Tom, and I would expand that and say that I don't think most people are focused on the fact that if Republicans can't win Texas at the presidential level, forget presidential politics for the next generation. Democrats win every time. We're going to have 41 electoral votes starting next cycle in 2021. And if you want to have any chance of conservative leadership in the national government, and if you want Texas to run like a Swiss watch, like it has for the last 30 years, you need conservative leadership at the state level. And the only way to do that is keep electing people who are going to govern from a conservative fashion. Thanks, Tom. That was a great question.
George, we're going to go now to a call. Yeah, we're going to go to a question from Tom Luce, who's on the line. So we're going to unmute Tom's line. And Mr. Luce, if you're on the line, please feel free to ask your question.
George, this is Tom, and really it's not a question. It's a comment and suggestion regarding what you and Tom Hicks were discussing, which personally I think is a major issue confronting the state. But I think Republican leadership needs to step forward and start the solution with something that I don't understand why it's not politically acceptable to do this, and that is we should start immediately with any new hire at the state level with a different benefit program that's equal to the private sector, meaning 401ks, not defined pension benefit programs, and at least stop the future bleeding. In other words, the whole concept of pensions was to attract employees to the government sector because in the old days, the private sector had defined benefit programs. No private sector company has those anymore. And the public sector is the only one that is continuing to build up liabilities. Now, you're going to have a political fight of the century if you try to take benefits away, but at least we could stop the bleeding and say every new state employee starts with a new program.
Such an obvious point and such a big game changer from a policy standpoint. I guess we'll see whether our political leadership in Austin has the character and courage to do something like that. And Tom, I'm having a really, really good day when I get back-to-back questions and comments from Tom Hicks and Tom Luce. I'm in good company. And I would give a shameless plug to everyone on this call for the initiative that Tom is the chairman of, which is Texas 2036, which is an attempt to identify all the significant issues our state is going to face the next 30 to 40 years. Many of us won't be around in 2050, 2060 when we've got 50 to 60 million people in the state. But Tom is addressing getting in front of those issues and talking about what the required solutions look like. And politicians, for the most part, because they're focused on getting reelected every time, are not focusing on those significantly because they don't want to jeopardize their reelection through addressing serious challenges to the state. So that pension fund is one. Lobby your elected officials to address this, and let's find somebody to put a bill out for that. And all of those of you on the call, please Google Texas 2036, go to that website, and find a way to help Tom make great policy for our children and grandchildren going forward. Thank you, Tom.
And there's just no excuse for a Republican not to support doing that today.
Except they're scared.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not as if we're not going to hire somebody who would work in state government. They don't have a better alternative in the private sector.
It's a no-brainer.
Great. Well, thanks for that question, Mr. Luce. George, we have another caller on the line. Whit Roberts has a question, and we're going to unmute his line. Whit, are you there?
I am. George,
thank
you very much for your Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, George. I would be interested in your views on U.S. foreign relations over the next 4 years, depending on who is our president, both with respect to our traditional allies and our traditional adversaries.
Well, I'd say I hit the trifecta, but I hit whatever the 4 version of the trifecta is with John Grimes, Tom Hicks, Tom Luce, and Whit Roberts. Talk about good questioners. So I think foreign policy is immensely more complex than the far right or the far left would make it in terms of the way this president has been conducting foreign policy. Obviously, he sticks his fingers in the eyes of many of our allies over and over and over again. Obviously, he has had very warm relationships with people who run countries that are ideologically distinct from us, to be polite at best and not even as blunt as I should be, whether it's North Korea or Russia or China, until we had the big trade war and then the pandemic happened. But when you listen to the mainstream media and the left, it's all this fire and brimstone about how dangerous Trump is and all these horrible things he's done and all that. I actually like a lot of what he's done. I'm just going to go on the record for that. There's other things he's done I'm not a big fan of, but pressing NATO to spend 2% of GDP on their defense instead of relying on us too much, I love it. Pulling troops out of Europe and South Korea and all these places we've been forever, I love it. You talk to the neoconservatives, and none of them ever want to remove troops from various parts around the world. It's time. Pulling troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, I love it. Taking China to task for its lying, cheating, stealing, and evil behavior, both towards religious people internally, domestically, and with all the trade abominations of the Chinese over the years. I love it that he's taken them on for that. Having the capital of Israel in Jerusalem, talking to UAE and I can't remember whether it's Bahrain, into recognizing Israel and doing it at the White House. That's spectacular. I heard this morning someone saying, if a Democratic president had achieved that, it would be like 24/7 news on the mainstream media, and that person would win the Nobel Prize. And because it's Trump, and so many people just loathe Trump as a human being, and all the Trump derangement syndrome, you're not even hearing that much about it. You think about when Jimmy Carter brought together Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to normalize with Egypt and Israel. I mean, that was huge. So is there volatility? Is the naivete with respect to North Korea there? Have we alienated some allies like Germany and Australia initially and some others? Have we been ignoring some parts of the world that are important? Sure. Nobody gets foreign policy totally right, though. And I would say that, for the most part, from what I can see, Secretary Pompeo and the Secretary of Defense are both running their institutions little controversy around Pompeo with his wife and with some other things that look political, but I think they're both doing a really nice job and mainly under the radar and lower key and professional. I think that as much as I admire General Mattis, that he became a distraction, and I think Secretary Tillerson was a distraction almost from the beginning. I know they're outstanding men, and they properly were trying to call the president to account for a lot of volatility and frankly, ignorance on the way we do policy. But it's interesting to me how much the president has gotten right, even with all the volatility. And to me, it shows how complicated all this stuff is. I really worry about a President Biden foreign policy. I think we go right back to an establishment, institutional foreign policy. I'm not sure he'd be as tough on China. I think he'd try to resurrect the Iranian deal, which I think was an abomination completely. I don't know. I think both have their downside, but I'm really happy with a lot we've gotten in the last 4 years. I think just the change in the Middle East is just monumental. So I hope I answered your question okay.
Thanks,
Brandon,
George.
let's take two more.
All right. We've got two more in the queue, so that's perfect. We're going to end with Bryce Mueller and Leslie Fitzpatrick. So, Bryce, we're going to go ahead and unmute your line, and you can ask your question.
Perfect. Thank you. And, George, this ends the run of good question askers. I apologize. But
I doubt it.
At the beginning of the conversation, you talked a little bit about how we had, two sort of over-the-hill candidates running for the presidency, and you also referenced sort of a multitude of Senate races where Republicans were running a seemingly mediocre candidate or otherwise. What do you attribute the lack of, whether it's bench or talent level or interest in terms of, the highest quality of potential politicians and the current landscape, and what do you think has to be done to change that going forward?
Great question, Bryce. Thank you, and thanks for asking it. So I want to make clear that my comment on septuagenarians about the president and former Vice President Biden is not a personal attack on either one of them. I just don't think people over 70 should be president of the United States. I think it's too far along in your lifespan, and I would say from my perspective, and I hope I'm as objective as I can be, I sure try to be, the president looks far more sharp and energetic and mentally acute than the former vice president. But I think the time to be president is in your 50s and 60s. I think that's when you've got the most experience, you've got plenty of remaining energy, and you're best suited to handle the job. You see a lot of these hyper-aggressive, mainly young men, some young women running for president in their 40s. They're not ready for the job. They're just not. I mean, so many ran last time around and are plotting to run this time around that they just don't have the life experience to do the job well. So that's kind of my opinion on the right age to be president, to be clear. On the candidate issue, I'm not sure it's solvable at the national issue. I think if you're around as many politicians as I've unfortunately had the burden of being around, you realize that most of them are not genuine, they're not transparent, they're all about raising money, and they're all about getting reelected. And they're hyper ambitious and self-interested. I would point out John Cornyn as one exception to that rule, that he's just a really selfless public servant. I feel like John Thune of South Dakota fits in that category. I feel like Bill Frist, who's now retired, fits in that category. But most of them, it's just 24/7 all about them. And I think it's because we've created a career in politics. And this is where I'm pretty old-fashioned. I think that maybe Hamilton got the better of most arguments with Jefferson, but Jefferson had the citizen, legislator, and executive model down to a T. I would like to see a whole lot more people who want to go do a political job for 4 years, 8 years, maybe 12 at the very most, come from the private sector, from the best of nonprofits, civic leadership, business, and people who've had 20 to 40-year careers of great mark and distinction, pursuing those offices for a limited amount of time instead of somebody who just goes to Washington for 50 years and squats. And it's all about them at the end of the day. Or somebody who goes down to Austin for 20, 30, 40 years and squats. I just think that eventually that corrupts every single person who stays that long, that they get drunk with authority and power and notoriety, and they become a shadow of who they aspire to be initially. So I'm all for term limits. I don't think we'll ever get it at the national level because of all the self-interested politicians. I think we can definitely get it at the state level with the right leadership. So that to me is the cure, but we're unlikely to get much of it unless things get really so drastically bad in this country that we demand not just change, but radical change away from this career political class, which is why the swamp has an approval rating, I think, under 10%. Everybody sees it. It's a disease. Okay, Randon, let's do one more.
All right, Leslie Fitzpatrick, you are unmuted and you can ask your question for George.
Thank you, Randon. Thank you, Mr. Seay. I want to know, because I'm very interested in this presidential race, you mentioned 6 states in play. Would you mind letting us know what you think those 6 states are?
Leslie, great question. That's a great one to close on. I appreciate you correcting an oversight I made because I had roughly 6 to 8 states listed on a sheet of paper, and I guess I just skipped over it and didn't read them. Yeah, it's pretty clear what the key states are, and I'll kind of map them out for you. So Arizona, Trump won by 4 last time. He's behind in every poll this time, but it's close. Nevada, Trump lost by, I believe, 2 last time, and he's behind by a similar or larger amount this time, but because of Biden's kind of inability to appeal to the Hispanic voter, that one's still in play as well. Minnesota, Republicans think they can actually flip Minnesota this time around. I'm not sure they're right, but the polls are pretty close. At least some of them are. Wisconsin, that Trump actually won last time around, and is a huge firefight there. And how the riots and protests, which have been extensive there, and COVID, and a Democrat being in the governor's mansion, having beaten Scott Walker, how that fits in that, I don't really know. But that one's tight. Michigan's battleground again because of the blue-collar Anglo voter there, and also because Trump has really made an inroads with the African-American voter. If you're objective and not a victim of Trump derangement syndrome or just against him for everything, he's really done a lot for the African-American citizen. He's the unemployment rate went to an all-time low for African-Americans. He has done all he can to support and advance historically black universities, which is huge, and he's really reached out to the black religious community. So I maybe that carries him over the top of Michigan. I'm not sure. Pennsylvania, we hear a lot about Pennsylvania, and it's tight and will continue to be tight. Trump's going to win Ohio, so just that one doesn't really count. North Carolina is super close this time around. Trump won it last time around. I bet Trump wins that, but it's going to be pretty tight. And you might be able to put New Hampshire in this list. Maybe. I doubt it, though. I think that's going to be blue. And a lot of people want to put Georgia on this list, and it may be, which shows a lot of change in Georgia, but I would be hesitant to do that. So those are kind of your key states, and it's all really going to come down to that because I forgot about Florida. You got to include Florida, but I think Trump's going to win Florida. I may be wrong, but I think that there's a lot more enthusiasm in the Hispanic community and in the Anglo community for Trump in Florida, and I just don't think Biden is resonating unless there's been a swing in the senior citizen vote from Trump to Biden for reasons I don't completely understand. And if that is enormous because of the overwhelming number of senior citizens in Florida, maybe Biden wins, but I bet Trump wins Florida. So those are the states. So I hope that answers your question comprehensively and with some detail. And with that, I would just thank everybody for giving me part of your Wednesday today, and I hope this has been helpful. And please give me feedback if I can do something different that would be more helpful. So, Brandon, why don't you close us up?
Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining. We are going to be sharing this recording on George's Facebook page, as well as in the next Annandale newsletter update. So thanks again for joining us, for your time.